Thank you. Good afternoon. This hearing is called to order. I want to recognize the presence of a quorum of committee members, and the members of the committee in attendance are Vice Chair Brian O'Neill, Council members Derek Green, Ellen Gim, Jamie Gauthier, Kendra Brooks, Mark Squilla, Maria Quinones-Sanchez, and Cindy Bass. Thank you all for being here. This is the public hearing of the Committee on Fiscal Responsibility and Intergovernmental Cooperation. The purpose of this public hearing is to hear testimony on Resolution 200406. Introduce this resolution with co-sponsors Council members Parker, Council member Green, Council member Quinones-Sanchez, Council member Squilla, Council member Gilmore Richardson, Council member Bass, and Council member Thomas. I understand that state law currently requires that the following announcement be made at the beginning of every remote public hearing as follows. Due to the current public health emergency, City Council committees are currently meeting remotely. We are using Microsoft Teams to make these remote hearings possible. Instructions for how the public may view and offer public testimony at public hearings of council committees are included in the public hearing notices that are published in the Daily News, Inquirer, and Legal Intelligencer prior to the hearings and can also be found on phlcouncil.com. The clerk will now please read the title of the resolution before this committee today.
Authorizing the Committee on Fiscal Stability and Intergovernmental Cooperation to hold quarterly hearings that include monthly reporting requirements to discuss the fiscal position and overarching social impact goals of the city, including and as related to the 5-year plan, and reporting requirements set forth in the quarterly city manager's report as submitted to the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority.
Thank you, Ms. Gerbeck. I just wanted to open up today with really thanking everyone who have worked so hard to stay on top of the city's finances, especially in this pandemic. It's unprecedented. And I know a lot goes into tracking down all this data we're going to hear, studying it, finding the weaknesses, and working to make adjustments in this unusual pandemic time. So I want to thank the administration's finance team, PICA, my staff, my colleagues, their staff, and our council finance team for diving into this data. We have a lot to get through, and I'd like to be sure we have time for questions. So let's get started. Ms. Gerbeck, please call the first panel of witnesses.
Rob Dubow, Marissa Waxman, and Harvey Rice.
So I'd like to ask Rob if you could testify first to everything except the recovery officer's report, and then I'll ask everyone to hold questions until Harvey Rice is also given testimony.
Got it. We'll start. Thanks. So good afternoon, Councilmember Dom and members of the committee. Rob Dubow, Finance Director, and I'm here to testify on Resolution 200406 regarding the current fiscal position of the city and our recovery efforts. As you mentioned, for this part of the discussion, we'll just focus on our fiscal position. I'm joined by Marissa Waxman, Vice Director, for the first part of the testimony, and then on the second panel, I'll be joined by Sarah DeWolf, our Recovery Officer. And for each section, I'll just give an overview and then hand it over to Marissa and then later Sarah for details. So if you go to, thank you, you beat me there, Marissa, to slide 4. It gives you kind of a snapshot of where we are, which is we are projecting that our FY21 fund balance will end at a little under $23 million. That's about $29 million less than expected. It's also much less than our internal goal and best practice, and we have another graph to illustrate that. And really the bottom line about it is that if we don't see recovery or we don't get additional help from the federal government, it's going to be a very tough second half of the year. On the next slide, show fund balance comparisons. So you can see here what our fund balance has been over the last 3 years. It's gone from just under $439 million in FY19 down to about $291 million last year, and then the projected roughly $23 million this year. If we were at our internal goal, we'd be somewhere between 292 and 390. And if we were where the Government Finance Officers Association says we should be, which is 2 months worth of of obligations, we'd be more like 828 million. So instead of being at about 2 months worth of obligations, we're at about 2 days. So obviously we're in a tight situation. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Marissa to walk through more of the details.
Great. Thank you, Rob. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about how things went in the first quarter. We had $750 million worth of revenue, which, slight bit of good news, slightly higher than we had anticipated in the adopted budget by about $49 million. And that was mainly, however, due to the timing and anticipated revenues and some delayed things coming in that should have come in last year. So don't get excited by that additional $49 million, because overall for the year, the only adjustment at this point we are making to our revenues is about $680,000 increase. And so there's a lot of things up, a lot of things down. But we did get some things earlier. We do have to do some downward revisions of receipts later in the year as a result. It just came in. So our first quarter actuals versus projections aren't indicative of our full year. What really is, we're not yet showing, but gives us the greatest pause and concern, is that our budget was built on having a rotten, terrible first quarter and then things getting better. And we hit it on the nose. The rotten, terrible first quarter is basically exactly what we got. But unfortunately, we are not yet seeing conditions improve the way that we thought they would and the way that our projections anticipated. And so if the current levels of year-over-year receipts month to month stay the same for the rest of the fiscal year, we would expect to see $70 to $100 million less in revenues than we were currently projecting. So that is a real risk for us. We haven't yet made those downward revisions. We need to watch and see, but there is a real risk there. Wanted to break out for you sort of revenue stream by revenue stream, what we saw in the first quarter versus what we had planned. And so taxes came in a bit high by about 38 million. Some of that, again, timing. The locally generated non-tax revenues was a bit low, 15 million. And our biggest sources of those non-tax revenues are license and permit fees, things that are often closely linked to the state of the economy and what's happening there. We did see some improvements this quarter over our initial expectations from revenue from other governments, as well as the PICA city account. We classify that as other governments, but really that's just the resident portion of the wage tax looking a little bit stronger than we had thought it would. But again, we think this is timing, and that first quarter performance is not indicative of what we're going to see in the balance of the fiscal year. I wanted to dig deeper for you into the revenue trends on the wage tax, because this is our, number one, it is our largest local revenue stream. And secondly, it's the one that we can see on a fairly consistent, regular basis. We won't see our real estate taxes or our business taxes until later in the fiscal year. And what this does is the top left box shows you where we are month to month, year over year for the entire wage tax. And you can see that in August and September, we started getting back to at least even with the prior year, but saw a dip again in October. I will say that dip, keep in mind some things are just timing. We then got a $30 million payment on November 1st. So looking at individual months can be a bit misleading. But that shows you big picture. But then you can see there's real variation from sector to sector. And so you can see that construction has gotten back to where they were after sort of a V-shaped dip there, with coming down lowest in May. In May is when you'll see sort of the lowest. While April was sort of the shutdown because there's a slight lag, you'll see May really reflecting that. And you can see in this then the industries that have not been coming back or have remained the most below last year. Hospitality and entertainment is the one that has stayed the most below. Also some with professional services. So that's where the wage tax is looking. And I do want to thank the Department of Revenue for some of this incredible disaggregated data and graphics. And we wanted to go actually even further with this to show you within a sector what we're seeing, because really the impacts of this are varied. And so in here you can see the solid red line. The one that is sort of had the worst impact is doctors and dentists. And we see that as some of the things where, earlier today we testified about underspends from city employee medical benefits. in the last quarter of FY20. And that's because doctor's office, dentists were closed, certain things folks were deferring. And you can see this here in our wage tax data. Some of the other sectors are actually stayed above, like social services, above last year's wage tax collection. So again, variation here. And as I recommended, don't look at any single month, though, particularly October in isolation, because of some timing issues. We've got a bunch of money in on November 1st. And I wanted to give you, beyond the wage tax, some of the variation in the other taxes we collect. And what you're seeing here is the ones that you would expect to see at the bottom, most impacted by the closures: hotel, liquor by the drink, which is liquor sold in bars and restaurants; the amusement tax, which primarily is derived from professional sporting events, at least 85% of that, are the ones that are showing the greatest year-over-year declines on a monthly basis, whereas the beverage tax is, still seeing a decline, but much closer to the prior year. And we're obviously going to be looking at this as we look at, current conditions and shutdowns and what does that mean. Also, we've seen some interesting trends with our realty transfer tax. And as with our other taxes, we are seeing a reduction in the number of sales, but there is the number of sales and the tax amount are not in lockstep. And so we can see what's going on with prices here, primarily in the sort of house condo area, where you can see calendar year, January through September, the tax amount down by about 12%, while the number of sales is down by 22%. And so that's telling us that the individual house prices are probably going up even as the volume goes down. So that was where the money is coming from and how that's going. Wanted to share with you how the money is going out. So the general fund obligations in the first quarter of the fiscal year were $1.22 billion, about $11 million more than the adopted budget, primarily due to some large expenses around the presidential election, and then additional support we wanted to put into rental assistance, eviction diversion, and the public health needs, as well as those higher than anticipated waste disposal obligations. And so in the FY21 operating budget mid-year transfer, you'll see that those are the things we were looking to add funding for, because those were the expenses higher than initially planned. And so as a result, after that mid-year transfer, the year-end obligations are projected to now be $64 million more than the adopted budget. That was the amount in the proposed version of the FY21 mid-year. However, that was amended today, so now that number is a little bit higher. Some of that 64, however, is offset by some new revenues in the public health area. But most of that is driven by fire personnel costs, election costs, and the waste disposal fees. And so this is just a summary of the items that had a net impact on the mid-year, on the city's fund balance. Some of the items, as I said, that are in there also were just moving money within a department, or are ones that were offset by revenue. But this is, I just want to make sure you had this summary sheet of the items in the mid-year transfer ordinance. We also just wanted to, in addition to just talking about the money coming in, the money going out, talk a bit about performance and staffing and what is going on. And so as of September 30th, we wanted to provide some information around overtime. We know, obviously, Harvey Rice is here from PICA, and that's an area that's of key concern for them. And we wanted to share that in the first quarter, overtime spending of $40 million is about 24% less than it was this time last year, which makes sense. A lot of activities we'd normally be doing are not happening. A key theme running across all of our departments is this overtime they are not putting towards special events. That is an area that a number of them have. So with the exception of the fire department, we're seeing decreases for departments with significant overtime budgets. But overtime alone is also, can't be looked at in a vacuum. One of the things we think about is leave usage, who is available to work, because oftentimes overtime is what you use to compensate when folks are not there, particularly in our areas that have sort of mandated staffing levels, that you need a certain ratio of staff to kids in the juvenile justice center. You need a certain number of people to put on a fire truck. And So we were looking at leave usage this year as compared to last year, and the data show that it is down dramatically. We think there's a couple of things going on there, though. One is we're now a year into One Philly, and we think there's just better human data entry at this point. And honestly, it's still not perfect. My boss, Rob Dubow, had to correct my timesheet last month last pay period because I put in the wrong code. But we're seeing less and less of that as folks get familiar with the system. And so we're seeing that. But we also think there's a number of other things going on. As I mentioned, employees were not using their medical benefits. We think as a result, they weren't taking as much sick leave. Folks weren't taking the same level of vacation leave during the shutdown. And so that contributes to the changes in leave usage. Wanted to share also just how many staff we have on hand. The adopted budget includes close to 24,000 in the general fund, a total of 30,589 across all funds. That's how many positions were funded for. But the actual folks on board at the end of September was about 2,500 less than that. So fewer folks available to do work. And again, that combined with the leave usage sometimes paints a picture of then the overtime usage. And so, but really the point of this is performance. What services are we able to provide? And so in the quarterly city managers report, we include over 100 performance measures across a number of departments tracking service delivery and activity. And at the end of this quarter, close to 2/3 of those were on track to meet or exceed their targets for the year. Given the pandemic, that's pretty impressive, but obviously not as great as a normal year. Some things, clearly, if you look in the public safety area, there are clear challenges. Those are borne out. In others, it's just the nature of the shutdown. Some of the measures from the free library have to do with number of visitors. Given where we are, obviously, they're not going to hit their visitor numbers that they had initially projected. Wanted to then drill down a little bit more beyond the quarterly city managers report to talk about spending through October. So it takes us through the first third of the year. One of the things we've added this year are monthly spending reports to track where we are month to month, and then on a year-to-date basis, just to make sure that we are staying within our budget. And so what we have here is a breakdown for you showing that we have spent in the first third of the year slightly more than 1/3 of the dollars. But when I say spent, that is actually literally cash out the door and then funds that are already encumbered. Some departments encumber their funds for certain contracts early in the year, so it looks like they've spent all of them. For example, City Council encumbers all of its dollars for court reporters in the first month of the fiscal year, even though that money is then spent out over the course of the year. So an easier way to then sort of look at that is look and see who spent that third or not, or obligated at the encumbrance and the expenditure. And so a couple of the ones that you will see that far exceed that are ones that encumber early in the year. For example, Commerce makes a $15 million payment for the convention center subsidy. That is a huge chunk of their budget. That happens earlier in the year. DBH IDS encumbers the vast majority of their contracts with providers very early on. The Sinking Fund Commission pays a lot of the debt service early in the year. So it's normal to see variation here in terms of what percent has been spent so far and not spent. But this is a good way to ask some questions. But we do dig deeper. When you just look at Class 100, this is where I'd be concerned if things look tremendously out of whack. And so what you can see here is that most departments are well within that 1/3 of the year's worth of personnel expenses, with 1/3 of the year down. There are a couple of ones that you'll notice that are popping up above the dotted line, but also those are ones that we are aware of and addressing. So those are items that are then included in the mid-year transfer ordinance. So you see the city commissioners and what they just had to do through the election. Not surprising that they're above. Commerce and the district attorney were both in the mid-year transfer to make some adjustments to their budgets to either move money into Class 100 or add it in total. But there is basically, by tracking this on a monthly basis, gives us a sense that we are on track and where we should be. But obviously, we need to continue to monitor our revenues, the economy very carefully, and make sure that our spending doesn't get ahead of that. So that is pretty much where we are at the moment. And I know you wanted to pause at this point for the presentation from PICA before we go back to the recovery. And happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Marissa. Let's hold the questions and we'll ask Harvey Rice. That was a great presentation, by the way. Thank you. And let's ask Mr. Rice to give his presentation from PICA. You might be on mute, Mr. Rice. I think you're on mute.
Yeah. Good afternoon, Chairperson Dom and members of the City Council. As you know, my name is Harvey Rice. I'm the Executive Director of PICA. We are the state oversight agency for the City of Philadelphia. Thank you for allowing me to testify today to speak about PICA's report on the quarterly city manager's report for the first quarter, which ended September 30th, as well as our reports on the city revenues, the budget obligations, both for September and October, as well as the overtime report for the first quarter of this fiscal year. I have prepared a short PowerPoint presentation with highlights of all these reports and a synopsis of our revenue, budget, obligations, and overtime. Let me share it with you. Okay, I'm not going to go, since Marissa and Rob did a pretty good job, excellent job of the numbers. So I'm not going to dwell on the numbers already presented. I'll point out some of our observations and our concerns. When we compiled our report, we usually issue a report. But however, we noticed, as you can see, that the fund balance decreased from 51.3 million from July, which is what the board in the 5-year plan that the board adopted, to now 22.8 million. At the time in July, we said that 51.3 million was a concern of fund balance, was a concern of ours. And then now we see that it was dropped to 22.8 million. And this quarterly report was complete. The end of the quarter was September 30th. This is prior to the surge and the possible resurge of the pandemic. So if that and some of the measures that the city has just recently put into place, so which could affect revenues in the coming months. So as a result, instead of just issuing a report, at the time we sent the city a letter stating that this was a concern of PICA, and that at the time when they issued their report, the 5-year plan in July, at that time we asked them to also put contingencies in for this 51.3 million fund balance in July. So we followed that up, and we said we're asking you to start looking at and start implementing some of these contingencies so that the city isn't saddled with a very small fund balance, which the pandemic or one event or another or two events could either deplete it or wipe it out completely. So the city responded, and in their response, they mentioned that it looks like that 75 million of personnel costs that have already been applied to the general fund can be reimbursed through the CARES Act. So that would bring the fund balance up to about 90 million. And then the city finance director also responded, stating that they're now looking at the contingency plan that they put together and working with the departments to see if they can start implementing some of those contingencies as we speak. So the other numbers on this were discussed. The revenues, as Marissa stated, the revenues are only 700,000 more than projected. However, it is a timing issue of different taxes and when they're collected. So we're concerned that they project between 70 million and 100 million less revenues than projected in the 5-year plan, which is a concern of ours. That's why PICA, we look at the revenue collections every month, not just a quarter, and so we'll keep a close eye on that, and we can run it against all the different tax types to see where concerns may lie as early on as possible. But I think we need a couple more months of revenue collections, and whether the surge and the resurge will have a drastic impact in the projections already submitted. I've already spoken about this. Our revenues, the same figures that Marissa and Rob spoke about, and then obligations by class. As you know, as they said, we're spending more than we're taking in. So to do that, they're using money from the fund balances that were transferred over from the last fiscal year. Full-time positions, slight decrease through the first quarter, and that's understandable since the city, since the pandemic, has put a freeze on hiring. So that is probably attrition through retirement and other factors. And overtime. As you know, PICA is very concerned about overtime costs. And as we saw in the first quarter, we see a drop of $12.8 million less in overtime than the first quarter of fiscal year 2020, which is about a decrease of about 24%. However, it's because of the nature of that we're in and the pandemic and more people working at home, it's hard. There's a lost comparability here to last year. Because it's not apples to apples, basically. So while we see that a decrease is evident, we're taking it with caution. And if you match it against their allocations for the first quarter, they're still above slightly spending their overtime allocation. So it's something that we not only issue a quarterly report, but we look at every monthly on the overtime, and we report the monthly spending to the board, and so that they're tracking it every month, so that we can do the best. The city can do the best to lower this overtime. What I would like to say is when Marissa was speaking about the class 100 and how it was below other than the city commissioners. That's true. But if we still do a good job of reducing overtime, those orange bars would even be lower. So we got to take that into consideration. And we're working with the city right now. The city is developing overtime action plans, and we should have all of them by the end of December, and PICA will be working with them, going through them, as well as we have offered other suggestions on this overtime, that there should someone in each department responsible for the overtime, as well as one person within city government responsible for the overtime. And one of the board members suggested that there be some sort of a penalty be put into the departments who aren't controlling overtime, who aren't budgeting it correctly, so that each department in the future takes this seriously and reduces overtime going forward, which will help reduce class 100, which would then have more money that we could raise a fund balance, or we could put more money in the budget stabilization reserve fund, other opportunities for that money. And our revenues through October, as you can see, we collected $208 million compared to $253 million last year, a decline of about $45 million or almost 18%. the only tax categories to increase in October and the year to date are real estate and BERT taxes. And as you know, BERT is very hard to project, especially when yesterday's announcement on city business taxes, we need to readjust BERT going forward to see what that impact will be, and then what that impact will be on the total revenues. And our obligations through October, as I mentioned before, it's higher than the monthly spend of 16.6%. So they're doing slightly higher in their obligations, but as Marissa pointed out, that there are many departments such as commerce, such as finance, such as sinking fund, and other departments who had a lot of encumbrances early on in the first quarter. But we need to see that percentage goes down as we get through the fiscal year. And this is city department overtime through October, 2020 versus 2021. As you can see, there's 3 departments that stand out. Even though they're small amounts, they've exceeded their allocation. And we were concerned fire's allocation is high, and some other police and streets, and we can understand streets being high because of the pandemic and because of the increased amount of trash that they have to collect, as well as the nature of their job and people calling out sick. You can understand that. But in some other departments where people were working at home and either overtime costs increased from last year, or they're more than what they should be at this period of time in the quarter against their allocation. These are questions that we have presented to the city. So I'm here to answer any questions that the council may have.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rice. And I thought what we could do is I have a few questions for the administration and you, and I'll ask away, and I'll ask my colleagues for any questions. So let me start with Marissa. On the presentation you gave us, I had a question on the $49.4 million of additional revenue that we're showing. Do you have any kind of breakdown of how much of that was delayed and how much of that was from 4601, so we get a clearer picture?
Yeah, I can pull that up. I don't have it off the top of my head. I know 38 million of the increase was taxes, and so the 4601 actually there was a net in the local non-tax of, we were actually at the end of the day down 15. That would have been down a whole bunch more because that's where we also show the revenues from asset sales. So I can try and pull that up, but I can also just follow up with the breakouts in a more detailed manner of sort of within those categories, more finely grained.
That's fine. And I had a question for you on the full-time employee chart. Mm-hmm. I think I saw 2,528 positions we haven't filled. Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming those positions are accounted for in our budget.
Yeah, and so there's a couple things that we do though. So one that was 2,500 across all funds, that's slightly less in general fund. And so what we do is in some departments, basically that's just, shouldn't that then just mean we're underspending? And so that's why in some of those in the departments, you will see underspends under a third of the year. But in other areas, that's sometimes why we're offsetting with overtime, that if the work still needs to be done, overtime's a tool. It's a way we do work. Sometimes we do it full-time staff. Sometimes we do it on overtime. Sometimes we contract it out. Other times we decide we're not going to do that work. But so there's an interplay there that if there's high vacancy, sometimes you'll see that higher overtime. But the last thing we do also budget in, particularly with departments that have trouble either filling positions just because of sort of structural issues over time, or they have high churn, we will build into the budget what we call a vacancy allowance, which is basically we reduce their class 100 to account for that. So, we know you would need $1 million if you were 100% filled positions, but we don't fund you $1 million. We might fund you 950. We take out a vacancy allowance because we know based on history, and that's usually with larger departments that have high turnover that you're never going to have 100% on, or departments that do their hiring in classes, so that there's always going to be time gaps. That the day a corrections officer retires, we can't step in a brand new folks. We've got to wait for a class to go through. So we do account for it in the budget. Sometimes you'll see an underspend if there's vacant positions, but other times we've already planned for that through that vacancy allowance, or need that money on the overtime side to get the work done that's not being done by somebody in that position.
So we have a hiring freeze right now. If we don't fill those 2,500 or so positions, have you accounted for all 2,500, or have you accounted for 1,000? Like, what could we possibly save in the budget if we don't fill those positions?
Just one thing to make clear, we don't have funding for those 30,589 positions for the full year. So it's not like there's a savings equal to that 2,500 difference. For the reasons Marissa was talking about, the difference is much smaller. So, and Marissa, I think you wanted to say something else.
Yeah, no, but take that into account. You don't have to give us the answer now, but if we don't fill those 2,500, even if it's for portions of the year or whatever, what type of savings could we possibly, realize from the budget? Are there other dollars that we could save if we don't, for the next 12 months, we just say, you know what, we're still in the hiring freeze. By the way, most businesses are laying people off. We're in a hiring freeze, and what savings can we achieve from that 2,500? You don't have to give me the answer today, but I think we should look at that.
Yeah, I was able, however, while we were chatting, to find the proceeds from 4601. That was $9.1 million. Okay. So 20% of that overage is just attributable to the 4601 proceeds coming in differently.
And by the way, I wanted to recognize Council members Kathy Gilmore Richardson and Council member Bobby Heenan, who've joined us. Thank you for joining. And here's my next question. We had the appropriations hearing this morning, and thank you to Chairman Maria Quinones-Sanchez. It was a good meeting. And we've heard that the reserves are, $22.9 million right now. But we've also heard that Harvey said that there's another 73 or 75 million that could be added to reserves. And so that's one question, if that's going to actually happen that way. And then the other question is, the fire department, we heard in the meeting today, has a $24 million overtime requirement. And I guess my question to the administration is there any type of operational changes that the administration is willing to try to implement in order to contain some of these costs and reduce our exposure on the expense side? Because I also heard in the meeting today that may not be the last request. There might be more money needed for the fire department.
I can take the recovery dollars one. This is part of what we're going to talk about in the second part of the hearing anyway. So in our allocation of recovery dollars, part of what we've done is allocated roughly $75 million of public health and public safety costs to the CRF funding, which in the guidance from the Treasury Office is explicitly allowed. If all those dollars do get charged to CRF, that would increase our fund balance. One of the things we have to think about, though, is what the second half of the year will look like in terms of COVID-related costs. And if COVID-related costs continue through the second half of the year and there's no more relief package, it's likely that what that will have done is kind of given us a reserve to help spend on those additional costs.
Okay. How about looking at operationally some of these overtimes and figuring out how we can cut that down dramatically?
So as Harvey mentioned, we're looking department by department for the significant spenders to figure out what the action plan should be. And so in some cases, what we're going to find is that it's actually just sort of like a budgeting thing, that we have a number of departments who their overall Class 100 budget, they've always underspent, but it was just the overtime line. So for some of those, we're just going to make sure that the budgeting is matching up to reality. In others, what we're doing is really then, and that's just budgeting, and we'll work that out. The others, what we're asking is, is your current overtime budget realistic? Yes or no? And in most cases, we're finding yes, where we're at now is realistic for this year. Granted, this year is very strange and you never know what else is going to be thrown at us. So there's a lot of caveats, unless there's giant snowstorms, unless there's something. And so from there, we're talking to departments saying, okay, well, you've said it's realistic, but do we want to change that at all? Do we want to spend less? And there's two ways you can do that. One, you can just decide we're going to provide a lower level of service. We're going to just not do a thing. Or on the alternative, how would we provide that service but do it differently, not using overtime? And so we're seeing, depending on the department, depending upon the program, a range of answers. We've got some departments where for them, hiring up makes sense. Filling their vacant positions is going to give them that relief and is what they want to do. And that'll lower their overtime, but obviously there's still cost impacts. Other departments, when we talk to them, they say, actually, hiring doesn't make sense, that this is sort of an amount that actually the overtime costs less than it would to hire a whole brand new body with benefits. And there are times where that cost benefit analysis shows overtime is better. And in some cases, they're saying, this is a service, a business we're going to get out of. We're not going to do this anymore. And then there's others where we're looking and seeing where are there technology enhancements or other things. Now, granted, those often will have upfront costs, but a great example we heard from L&I this week was looking at their Eclipse system. They've put in Eclipse, and Eclipse allows building inspections to be scheduled using either the interactive voice system or online, as opposed to the building inspectors themselves spending the time doing the scheduling. Well, if you don't have to do the scheduling, you've got more time to do the inspections. And so that's ways where we're seeing technology is helping us. So there's a whole range of things, but, and also overtime is a fairly small percentage of our overall budget. So we look at it as a component of an overall system. As I was mentioning, looking at our leave usage, making sure that folks not only are on the payroll but available for work is also part of this. So we're looking at sick leave and different things, and how do we make sure that folks are here? So there's a whole range of things, but sometimes overtime is the most efficient way to provide the service we want. Sometimes it's not. So that's why we're doing these deeper dives, department by department, within programs and departments, so that we can have really nuanced responses.
Thank you. I just want to make sure we're really focused on this, because we're in the second quarter right now. And we need to implement this very quickly, because otherwise these costs are going to run out of control. We're not going to have the revenues to cover it. So I just want to make sure we're on top of it. Let me go to my next question. I remember back in July, I think Harvey and Rob, you alluded to this in your testimony today. There were two different sets of projections. PICA had one projection for the city, and the city had another projection. The delta, the difference, was I think $75 million for the projected fiscal year 21 revenues. And I know that the PICA asked the city for a contingency plan back then, and I think one of you testified that we're looking at that contingency plan now. And I guess my question is, of the $75 million, are we looking at the contingency plan for all $75 million? And could you just give us a brief overview of what that means and what are the programs that you'd be implementing?
So to start with, I want to say, there was those difference in projections, and they really started with differences in how was FY20 going to even turn out. And because that would have caused, a change in fund balance going into FY21. As we monitored that, the actual outcomes exceeded the city's estimate, which were above PICA's for FY20. So we actually started out better than we wanted. So that was good. The city's projections held up. And so we didn't need to immediately dig into that contingency plan. And as we said, as of right now, we remain on track with the city's projections for revenues. But obviously, we have concerns. So we continue to revisit that contingency plan, see what's still available in terms of things that if it does start to go south, what can we still do? So we're looking at that contingency plan. We're also looking at what else, other options we have. And so that's something we're doing on a regular basis. Just to give you an example, one of the things in the contingency plan was we could delay the hiring of the new traffic safety enforcement officers, and that would have savings. We haven't brought those folks on yet, so that's still sort of counting towards the good. And so there's a number of things in that contingency plan that we're still able to, should we need to in this year, do, even though we're halfway in. Some of them, obviously, aren't as valuable as they would have been if we'd implemented them July 1st. But we continue to work through this process of identifying if we need to pull back at any point this year, timing wise, what can we do? And we try and do this very thoughtfully as well to make sure that we're not pulling back things that would be really hard to reinstate if, say, there's a federal stimulus or, or those revenues come there. We don't want to totally demolish something and then 6 weeks later find out that we can put it back together after we've let people go. So we're trying to be really thoughtful about the types of things and the ways that we can pull back literally on almost a month by month basis what are still good options in each month of the fiscal year. And of course, the most important is being very careful about adding any new expenses.
I would say this. I think we're at a point now where you need to pull the trigger on that and you need to implement that contingency plan. So I'd rather be conservative about this and be prepared for what could happen and be, just be ready for it. And I would say this, as far as traffic, I don't see any traffic. There's no traffic. I mean, it's not an issue right now. Probably can put that off for a year. Okay. There's no traffic right now. And I look at this money of $75 million. I go back to yesterday's long committee of the whole meeting where we needed $22 million or $24 million to fund a $400 million bond that I think eConsult did a report that could have a $1.2 or $3 billion effect on our economy. That's such a better way of taking this money of 75 and allocating 22 or 23 million a year to is better use of our resources probably at this time. So I hope we put that plan in place and save that 75 million. Two last quick questions. I have others. I want to open it up to my colleagues. The wage tax. I'm very concerned about the wage tax. I'm very concerned that, 40 or 41% of our city workers live outside of the city. And I'm concerned what that's going to look like as far as refunds or whatever. And I'm wondering if we have any tools to give us any kind of idea what that might look like.
So we continue to work with IHS Markit, who the city is outside economic consultants, and they actually update with us on a monthly basis what they're thinking the outlook is for the city's finances. And the issue of those commuters not coming back remains a big variable for us. But from the start, we saw this on the horizon, and we not only baked into our budget a short-term reduction, but we actually anticipated some permanent long-term shifts across the 5-year plan, even as the economy gets back to normal. So we have built that in. Whether or not we did that at the right level, it's too soon. We're not really going to have a good handle on that data until the calendar year ends. And then after that, folks are filing their taxes and asking for refunds. We'll see some of that a bit early if businesses are changing their withholding. But we also know that there's a lot of folks that they probably won't change their withholding now and later just ask us for a refund. And so we won't, it's one of those we won't really know until we know, particularly since it's still really fluid. Folks are at home now. We think there might be some permanent shifts, but what does that mean? Our laws basically say that, working from home, if your employer tells you you have to, well, then the wage tax is not due. But if you choose to for your convenience and it's an option, but you could work in the city, then the tax is due even if you choose to work at home. So given how large the wage tax is in terms of the share of our revenue stream and the importance of those commuters, that is something we're watching carefully. But I think that there's still a lot of uncertainty about the scale, but we've already built in a good chunk of pain from that.
And the last question, I'm going to go to my colleagues and I'll come back. In all this conversation, where does this leave funding for our school system? And are there concerns over the next few years for funding for schools?
Yep. So the district is projecting deficits beginning this year and increasing to about $200 million by next year and then increasing over the course of their 5-year plan. So that is a challenge that we're going to have to focus on as we go into the FY22 budget.
Well, what's the plan? That $200 million is a big number. What's our plan to cover that?
I think that's something we're going to have to really talk through as we develop our budget. And we don't have that plan yet.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I'll come back. I know my colleagues have some questions. And also want to recognize first Councilmember Helen Ginn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up on what Councilmember Dom was saying, at this stage, is the city able to make its payments to the school district as set forth in the 5-year plan?
Yes.
Okay, so we'll be able to maintain it. It's just that it won't be able to sustain the gap in the school district funding. Is that right?
Right. We don't have a plan as of yet to help close the deficits that the district is projecting.
And some of the areas that I think we've raised concerns about is, the administration decided to support the delay in the tax abatement. You have, I was trying to get clarity. It sounds like there's a $10 million UNO, which is a school district tax. Liquor by the drink tax has plummeted, as we can see already from the revenue reports. And I think that there was, we talked about how the PPA has given zero money over to the district. So we're whittling down to, those are primarily school district funded efforts. So we're left with property taxes and then whatever we can give over from the city and the state. Is that correct? Do you see other tax revenues? I guess there's a school income tax that's brought in $40 million.
School income tax. Okay. There still is a substantial amount of UNO. So they still get UNO. There's still the cigarette tax. There's still a number of taxes that go to the district. Did you say the school income tax?
Yes.
Still that.
And that's about what, 40 million, is it?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay.
And I mean, the other thing to remember is still the state, and that's where they get a substantial amount of their funding. So any solution to
Rob, we very well know that the state is, yes, we definitely know the state.
Yeah.
And I think that'll be an important aspect, I think, for sure in the spring. But does the city have any, I think you talked about this with Councilmember Dom, there's no additional flexibility in the cigarette tax, right? I know what the first 100 million goes towards, or it's cigarette tax. Sorry, I'm thinking sales tax.
Sales tax. Yeah.
I was thinking sales. Okay, that's right. And does the first 100 million of the sales tax go to the?
I think it's 120. 120 goes to school district. Anything above that goes to pensions.
Okay. And is that written into law so there's no flexibility with that?
That is in state law.
Yes.
Okay, got it. Okay. The second question that I had is a little bit about where the police department is on the overtime charts. I know it's not included. So is that in the mid-year transfer? How is that?
So there is nothing in the FY21 mid-year transfer to add to police's budget. They have some zero impact changes, moving money from 300 to 200 for body worn cameras. But if you're looking for the overtime spending for the police department, the best place to look for that is in the QCMR. And what I'm simultaneously doing is trying to open that document. And so what that breaks down department by department is the total class 100 as well as the overtime share of that for both the fiscal year to date and our projections for the full year. And so in the first quarter of FY21, the total class 100 budget or spending, actual spending for the police department was $153.679 million. And so 13.6 of that was overtime spending. That was about $900,000 under their budget. Or I'm sorry, over, but 900,000. So it's a bit under 10% is their overtime. Now, here's one more thing to think about.
It was also, the police overtime has decreased from the first quarter of the prior year.
Yeah. The other thing to be really thoughtful about or just to remember is that a good chunk of the police overtime is reimbursed later. It's, there are times where a bank, a retail store, an event will basically ask for service, but they will then later pay it. So there are offsets and things as the year goes through.
Could you maybe explain the FY20 police overtime? Is that what we're looking at?
Yeah. Maybe referencing is in the FY20 year-end transfer ordinance. The FY20 class 100, the total was 736 million, and the overtime was 78.7 million, and that was higher than initially budgeted, and that's why there needed to be additional money to true up the books for the end of FY20. And as you know, at the end of the fiscal year, we had a couple things going on that led to unplanned overtime within the police department. And that late in the fiscal year, there isn't really the ability to do something else to offset.
So you don't count police overtime, even though it was overtime because it occurred in FY20, but it is overtime. You just don't count it as that in the mid-year transfer?
So the overtime that was incurred in FY20 is being, there were 4 different bills today. 2 were capital, 2 were operating budget. One was the FY21 mid-year transfer, adjusting for the fiscal year we're currently in. And then there was also the FY20 year end. And what that does is do basically the cleaning up of the books for those essential government operations to make sure that they match the annual financial report.
So that overtime will show as overtime in FY20.
Okay. I'll have more questions about that, including was there a breakdown provided about that money for the police department in terms of where the overtime was incurred, in what divisions and how, and could that be shared with council members?
Yeah, I believe we may have shared that earlier in the year, but we can certainly they have different codes for different types of overtime, and that's something we can certainly forward.
Okay. Do you know when early in the year you would have shared that?
Not sure. I'm guessing in this, maybe around the time of the last, but that's information we have and we can easily provide. And it's possible that I'm misremembering, and instead we definitely provided it to somebody. If it wasn't council, it was PICA, but either way, we can forward it now.
Okay, thank you. I had one other question. For Parks and Recs, the lead remediation, what portion of the proposed funds is going to the lead remediation? And can you share information about what sites are being remediated?
So this is referring to some of the capital funding that we discussed with the transfer ordinance. And so that included funding for PPR, some of which was for fire safety systems, and that was about close to 5 million. And the total we had in there was 13 million. And what we have right now is we have 10 sites that we have known issues. We only have an actual bid in at Samuel's Playground so far, and that's $1 million. We don't anticipate that all 10 sites will need that level of remediation. So basically the balance there is from PPR about the ones where we don't yet have bids from those 10 sites. I don't know the 10 sites off the top of my head though, but Samuel's is the one we have the bid from.
And then we can can we ask that from you, or should we just go to Parks and Rec? Rob, you have a recommendation?
We can provide that. We'll provide it.
Great. Thank you. And then my last question is, how is OIT working to fix the One Philly paycheck system and some of the issues that are going on there? I know OIT has some money there, but we obviously hear a lot of concerns about One Philly, and so has there been any means now to take a look at what's being done to address those issues?
Sure. So One Philly went live about a year and a half ago. And if you kind of look at where it was even 6 months ago, where it is now, it's been consistently improving. The number of complaints we hear has gone down dramatically. The number of reports of checks that are inaccurate has gone down. So it's really been improving. It's been a joint effort of One Philly Group, Finance, OIT, CAO. So we've actually done a lot to improve that, and it's gotten a lot better. I do understand from the chair that he's been hearing some complaints still, so I do want to kind of understand what those are and make sure we're addressing them.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just hold my questions till later.
Thank you, Councilmember Gim. And there's, I think, a point of clarification from Councilmember Kathy Gilmore Richardson.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to go back to Councilmember Gim's question relative to the police budget and overtime in FY20. And I just wanted to ask for clarification. Will some of that be reimbursable relative to the CARES Act funding for essential workers?
So there is the guidance from Treasury on reimbursements for costs is that you make the presumption that public safety costs are related. So there's definitely some costs we could apply. There are questions that we have about what appropriate timing of what we apply. So it may or may not be, but it would be eligible.
Okay, so would you be able to provide us with a breakdown of what costs would be eligible for reimbursement and what costs would not be eligible for reimbursement, specifically around essential workers, primarily in the police department and the fire department, based on, I guess, some of the information that was provided even earlier today at the appropriations hearing. And, you know, I'm not on the appropriations committee, but I was listening to the hearing on and off earlier today. So if you could provide us with that breakdown, I think that would be very helpful.
Okay.
Okay. Thank
Yep.
you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your indulgence.
Thank you, Councilmember. And I'd like to call on Councilmember Jamie Gautier.
Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for all of your hard work stewarding the city's finances during this difficult time. I realize that you must be pretty head down, focused on Philadelphia's financial issues during this time, and I realize that the situation is pretty dire. But I'm also wondering, do you know how we're comparing in the management of our finances to other cities in this?
So one of the things that we're not scared to do is ask for help. And so right now the city is actually taking part in two different sort of cohort-based programs where it pulls together cities as well as subject matter experts. And so through the Knight Foundation, we're in a cohort around budget resiliency. And that's us and 5 other cities. Detroit, Miami, Macon, Georgia, which is a city county just like us. So that's interesting. As well as Bloomberg What Works Cities cohort, which is 30 cities around budgeting for equity and for recovery. So, and both of them are pulling in racial equity as well as just navigating the budget of whatever. So we thankfully get the chance to talk on a fairly regular basis with other cities. And I would say it runs the gamut. And so one of the things they look at is like, how much has people's fund balances changed? What do they have? What do they do? And there's a real range. I think we're doing a lot that is sort of similar to other cities, looking at how do we maximize our CARES Act dollars. But there's a couple different things going on that sort of make our condition unique. One, we're a city and county, so all of the services we have to provide. We also do all the sort of public health that in some places is not a city service. So that's really operationally makes us different. And then as we're looking at revenues, we've already been talking a bit about our vulnerability around the wage tax. A lot of other cities don't rely on the same mix of taxes that we have. And so, or they may rely more heavily on a real estate tax, which is a challenge for us because we can't have 2 different rates for residential and commercial. And so that is a bit more stable. Also, there are a lot of cities that are seeing some weaknesses in some taxes offset, or at least not seeing weaknesses in their sales tax because they're able to capture more of the internet sales. But there are challenges in the state law that means that the 2% for Philadelphia on an online transaction may not necessarily be collected. And so as we're seeing less sales at our brick and mortar stores and more online, even when the total amount's the same, that hurts us in our sales tax revenues. So we do spend a lot of time learning and talking. A lot of cities have had to, talking to colleagues in Chicago, doing a lot more layoffs than us and challenges there. Some other folks, because they have those more stable revenue streams and don't have as many local frontline responsibilities as us, doing a bit better. But we do make a point of touching base with all of our peers so that we can try and steal any good idea that we come across.
And another thing that differentiates us is that we do a 5-year plan. So that also means that we have to look at whatever we're doing and how it will impact over multiple years, which we've seen this time and we saw in the Great Recession too, where other jurisdictions could do one-time things. We really can't do that because we have to see what the impact is over multiple years.
I guess what I'm asking, and this may be too simplistic of a question to ask, but it's scary. It's scary to look at our fund balance and see that it's
Yep.
$1 million. How does that relate to how other cities are faring right now? And if we're doing similarly to how other cities are doing in this moment, does that provide a greater case for joint advocacy too, for assistance and for help?
Yeah, and there has been a great deal of joint advocacy among major cities, particularly pushing for more CARES Act relief, because I think there are a lot of cities that are facing the same kind of issues we have, cities and states. And if there isn't another relief package, I think you'll see lots of cities and states having really substantial problems.
Thank you. I'm thinking back to the chart that I believe I think Harvey showed this chart. It was a chart looking at all of the city agencies and their spending up to this point, and most folks were underneath the dotted line, but the folks who had gone over were over that dotted line. And I'm wondering how much of that overspending relates to maybe us having been too aggressive with some of the cuts that we made. So, for example, I was very concerned about the amount of cuts that we made to commerce, and I see that they overspent. Does that overspending, might that overspending mean that we took away too much from the department? And if so, does that help us to better peg where we want to land with this upcoming budget?
That's a great question. In the instance of commerce, what I would say is no, they actually spend basically no dollars on overtime. So the amount that they are over our head is actually some strategic decisions they made and what they came in the transfer ordinance for. What they asked to do was shift some money out of their class 200 so that they could do more class 100. So they're doing some corrections to the adopted budget, but within their same footprint of a budget. But they've just decided that what they wanted to do is they is have a couple more positions, or for folks there asking to step up and take more responsibilities, compensate them for that or look at equity. But that's not in the case of commerce driving any sort of overtime or unanticipated spending. If you want, I did just find my slide that shows our fund balance as a percent compared to 30 other peer cities. Would you like to see that?
Yes.
All right, let me pop that open because I think that might be really interesting for folks to see. Give me 1 second to try and make sure I get the right screen up. All right. I am doing a terrible job of being able to share. So instead, I'm just going to narrate. So what it says of the 30 cities that are in the cohort we're in for What Works Cities in Bloomberg, there are a handful of cities whose fund balance is 0. And that was and that's got to be weird, but that was like Savannah and Madison. Ours being, and this is actually older data, so this is from FY19. At 6%, we were at the same level as Oakland. Slightly below us at 5% was Denver, New Orleans, Rochester, Columbus, Ohio. Above us, Seattle has a 10%. Syracuse has 11%. Birmingham has 20%. But what they also found across this group of 30 cities, 83% of them were already having to implement budget cuts. So we're not alone. This is fairly widespread. And so what I'd say also is, we talked about how even before this, we were doing better in terms of fund balance than we had in the past, but we still weren't where we wanted to be. So that makes it harder.
Thank you. And then my last question is around the chart that you showed, Marissa, with the wage tax and how it was sort of functioning and progressing throughout the year by industry. I thought that was pretty interesting that we can break it down like that. How do we use that data, and does it help us to develop strategies for how we might assist different industries that are struggling right now?
So I think it's data that we use for a couple different things. One, to just understand and get insight. And one of the things our revenue department does is work a lot with PIDC, with Commerce, to understand what's going on. There's also often outside researchers who are stationed within the Department of Revenue trying to look at a bunch of that data and make assessments. So there's a real balance between tax privacy and what we're allowed to share. But once we can aggregate it up to certain sector levels, we do use that to internally and also with external partners inform a lot of our thinking around economic development, around our tax structure. So we are using it. We also have to use that to predict some of our other taxes. The wage tax data we get really frequently. So it's like an early indicator of what's going on. And so that begins to then inform our thinking as we're thinking about, well, what's our BERT tax collection going to look like next year? And so we use it for those revenue projections. But we also then have to be mindful, because while, you look and you'll see the hospitality industry and that retail trade being the hardest hit, those are actually, for our wage tax, fairly small sectors. While it impacts a lot of Philadelphians, because those are typically lower wage jobs, on the wage tax, which is a percent of income, that winds up being less impactful than if we were seeing that happen in some of our higher wage industries. And so as a share of our wage tax collections, that's actually not that much as, it's more that we see that on the human individual side for the employees, as opposed to the real impacts at that scale on our total wage tax collections.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Alan, I think you're on mute.
Oh, thank you, Councilmember Gautier. And let's go to Councilmember Derek Green. By the way, that is the word for 2020. You're on mute. So go ahead, Councilmember Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank both Rob and Marissa and Harvey for your presentations this afternoon. And I know, Harvey, you provided your presentation earlier. Marissa, are you able to share with the chair your PowerPoint? Because I did not see that as an attachment that was sent out by Laurel in preparation for this meeting.
Yes, we can share it. The answer is yes.
Yes, okay. The other thing is, just wanted to, as I was listening, and I'm going to digest this information in a little deeper way, but one of my concerns, and a lot of questions have been raised, especially from Council Member and the Chair, Dom, in reference to as we prepare for this upcoming fiscal year, as we go through the remainder of the current fiscal year, just have some real concerns in reference to a number of issues. I think having this type of conversation is very effective, but I think also coming together in a much more regular way. I think multiple entities. I know from a City Council perspective, we have the Budget Working Group, which includes myself as Finance Chair, Councilmember Dom, Majority Leader Parker, and Councilmember Maria Aquino-Sanchez, who's chaired the Appropriations Committee, as well as the Council President, and Councilmember Squilla as our Commerce Chair. But I think having that group, and we've been working with eConsult and giving us some information on things, as well as both our Budget Director, Ms. Waxman, Finance Director, Mr. DeBow, Mr. Rice from PICA. And then also, I know you worked on the IHS market in reference to some of the projections and modeling that you're doing. But I think as you are now meeting with various departments and preparing for the budget, and the mayor will have budget address in the first quarter of next calendar year, having opportunity for these various groups to come together just to kind of talk through some of these issues. I know this is not something that we traditionally have done in the past, but I think considering some of the real challenges with our current fund balance, as well as just trying to get through this pandemic, which has both been a health challenge, but also an economic crisis, I think it would be something that would make sense for these various parties to try to establish some type of regular meeting perspective, just to look at these issues as we are going through our budget process. I think it's going to be important because each of us have a specific role to play throughout the finances of the city, both from a budget perspective, a finance, appropriations, PICA, and the consultants that we work with. So one, hopefully you'll be able, which you did say you'll be able to provide that information, but two, having us come together, I think will be helpful because we're really going to have to have a full perspective of all the financial challenges that we have as a city, because there's a lot of moving parts, in addition to some of the labor issues we have on the horizon and the school district, and some of the other challenges going forward.
That's a really good idea. We should definitely do that.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm glad you agreed so readily to that. So that's something that now make reference to the council president, as well as I'm sure Councilmember Dom and others of the budget group will be supportive of that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Councilmember. Yep. Thank you, Councilmember Green. That's a great idea, by the way, and really, it's. I think that's great. Great idea. Let's go to Councilmember Kathy Gilmore Richardson.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And I apologize if I missed this, but I wanted to go back to a question that I had. How are we looking at or working on our restructuring of our tax structure and our over-reliance on the wage tax, particularly now in this new work from home environment? And I know that may be a loaded question. I know there's some folks doing work around this, but I wanted to talk about how we are looking at our tax structure in this new environment in a different way, and how are we working with our state and our federal partners around any, around our specific unique challenges and any potential relief packages that, may come from DC, and then subsequently, whatever may happen in Harrisburg. And lastly, I just want to get this in because I'm trying to do multiple meetings. How are we working to restructure some of our debt in this current environment? Thank you so much for your indulgence.
Sure. So let me start with the debt, and then Marissa can talk about taxes, which we have been working on. So we consistently look at our debt, look at where interest rates are to see whether there are opportunities for refundings or restructurings. We get lots of suggestions from underwriters and financial advisors about opportunities, and we're fairly regularly in the market with refundings as ways to reduce our debt service costs. And as the chair reminds us often, we are in a particularly low interest environment. So it's a really opportune time to keep looking for those opportunities and making sure we take advantage of them.
We have to ask.
And so on the tax side, that's something we're absolutely looking at and exploring as we move towards FY22. And I think there's a real tension here right now because there's so much uncertainty. We have long struggled with, we have a tax structure that was built for a manufacturing economy, and we didn't quite adjust for the service economy quickly enough, but we've been making those incremental improvements. The question is now, what exactly will the structure of the economy be, the nature of work, the location of work, and what does that look like on the other side of this? So I think that we've got this on the one hand, is this the moment where it makes sense to shake everything up? Or is it, or do we need to understand what the underlying economic activity is and what the tax bases might be before we make decisions? Because we're still in a really precarious position that we want to make sure that anything that we are putting into place generates sufficient revenue. Like the number one thing you need your tax structure to do is bring in enough money. So we're continuing to look at things. Obviously, there are things that are state changes that have been sort of long sought after, and looking at those. And I mentioned one of the things that is, personally to me, something that I think we really need to look at the state, which is the internet sales tax, and making sure that that gets updated so that if somebody is getting, ordering online and getting it delivered into Philadelphia, they're paying the 6% Pennsylvania, but they're not paying the 2% Philadelphia. They probably assume that they are. And if they're doing that instead of going to, the kitchen supply store in the Italian market, we're losing out on that 2%. So I think that there are some small things that, like, this is just highlighted that have been sort of thorns in our sides, and we'll need to be really thoughtful in trying to monitor what does the economy look like, and then how do we wrap a tax structure around that is sort of effective enough to generate the money we want, sort of efficient that we can actually administer it. And we're in the process of putting in a new tax system. And so, how do we time that to be sort of seamless with that, and something also that works with businesses, and then equitable. Another thing that we've been trying to be really intentional about is when we're thinking about changes in our tax structure, who's bearing the burden and what does that mean? And so when we, for example, were looking for additional revenue in the spring, one of the things we thought about was the parking tax. And that had sort of, all options are bad when you're trying to raise revenue, but the reason that was elevated for us was, one, we thought it would be effective. It would generate much of the expected money, because in the past that's been really an inelastic tax. That is, the rate changes, we see the money come in. And two, when we thought about equity, we were looking at a lot of information about car ownership broken down by race and who was likely to bear that burden and who wasn't. And so that's what we're trying to be really intentional as we think these things through as we move towards FY22.
So as a follow-up to your response, how are we identifying, as you mentioned, around like the internet sales tax, how are we identifying some of the recommendations and getting them to our state team, particularly, with this new term and the new leader in Representative McClinton, and we have Representative Harris. So how are we working closely with our state partners around identifying, potential avenues for additional revenue for the city in this moment? How do you all send them a list of recommendations? How do you transmit that information to our state partners and work very closely with them to see what we can potentially accomplish around bringing in additional revenue?
It's a combination of things. We have our Legislative Affairs Office has really good relationships with our delegation, so they spend a lot of time talking to members of the delegation, sharing ideas with them. We have lobbyists in Harrisburg. They also work closely with delegation and other members, and we do send things in writing to say, here are our priorities.
Okay, that's very, very helpful. I appreciate that feedback and look forward to continuing to work with you all. I'll come back on the next round around the QCMR and looking at the performance measures and how you use that within your analysis around what we're thinking with a variety of industries if we're looking at doing any type of restructuring around our tax structure. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Rob and Marissa.
Thank you, Councilmember Gilmore Richardson. And I had a question, I guess maybe this is for Rob. All this activity, what do you think the impact's going to be on our bond rating for the city?
When you say all this activity, which activity do you mean?
The drop in the reserve fund, the revenues, our financial situation.
Yeah, so I think from a rating age perspective, what they'll want to see is kind of where we come out at the other end, when we get into the spring, what things look like, and what our plans are to recover from what's ever hitting us. And I think, as Marissa was saying, cities around the country are getting this. It obviously is something rating agencies are paying close attention to. But I think what they really want to know is that we recognize what the challenges are and that we have plans to deal with them.
I guess my point answering the question, I don't want our rating to drop, which would increase our borrowing costs. And I guess what would be helpful is if you could share with us maybe what we need to do to make sure that doesn't happen. Like, what are the requirements that we need to understand as council members to prevent that rating from dropping, which kind of leads to Councilmember Green's idea.
So what we can do, if it's helpful, is share with you some of the rating agency reports, because they lay out really clearly what they're looking at. So they'll say, for example, that what could lead to a positive move in our rating is if fund balances increase, if we continue to show progress towards reducing our unfunded pension liability, if we handle our fixed costs, and then what could lead to downward action is exactly the opposite. Fund balance disappearing, pension fund getting worse, fixed costs going higher. So those are the things that they really look at. They want to understand what flexibility a jurisdiction has to deal with its problems. And the more flexibility, the happier they feel. So, while the wage tax presents many problems, the fact that we have flexibility with it is something that they look at and think, okay, that's a positive for a jurisdiction to have a tax that they have freedom to move. So there was, I won't name the city, but there's another city that the state basically took away its flexibility on its tax structure and they were downgraded immediately. So that's a really key thing for rating agencies.
That's good information. Thank you. And Marissa, I want to follow up on your comment about the sales tax. And I think there was a full economist conference PICA put on, actually, Harvey.
Yes.
Where it was mentioned that Philadelphia could only collect its local 2% sales tax, which Marissa was referring to, for online sales if the online seller actually had a physical presence, I think, within the city. And I guess I was under the impression that there was a Supreme Court ruling, I believe South Dakota versus Wayfair case, that eliminated that requirement of having a physical location. And is there any state laws in Pennsylvania that says otherwise? And if so, isn't now the absolute time? I mean, hopefully we could be contradicted by the Supreme Court's decision. And how does this impact our ability, Marissa, to collect the online sales? As you pointed out, we're probably losing on a lot of that 2%.
Yeah, so the Wayfair Supreme Court decision was huge in this area. It was like, among the tax nerds, like the biggest thing to happen in decades. Like, the tax attorneys were camped outside the Supreme Court. It was wild. And so what that did say is that, yes, a state could tax for basically sales into that state, even if there isn't a physical location. It doesn't say that it must. And so right now, the Pennsylvania state law doesn't require, basically we're still point of origin. Where does the sales start when it comes to Philadelphia's 2%, as opposed to where does the package land on a doorstep? And so that's what we'd be asking the state to change. So that's a state law that would need to change in order for us to capture that 2% from internet sales where there isn't a local Philadelphia retail location. And there is real complexity in there because some of your largest internet retailers are structured so that they have multiple corporate entities. And so there is real complexity, but that change, which at least say if they had a Pennsylvania location, could we collect when it lands on a Philadelphia doorstep, would, I think, be a significant revenue generator for us.
Are we working on making that happen?
Yeah, we've listed that as one of our key legislative priorities. And, to Councilwoman Richardson's point, that's something we're going to communicate to our delegations, people in Harrisburg, to make sure they know it's very important to us.
Right. Good. I have a question for Harvey. I don't want to leave you out there, Harvey, so I have some questions for you. Yesterday, City Council is considering making, we voted yesterday out of committee, I guess, changes to Philadelphia's tax policies to support new borrowing intended to fund affordable housing. From a fiscal stability perspective, how would you evaluate that potential impact of the tax changes and the new borrowing? And what should council be thinking about to ensure the city's fiscal health when weighing these options in front of us?
Well, I first would say that every little bit counts, and that whatever measures are put into place, that the cost of the borrowing does not override the implementation of the tax revenue shifts or decreases in certain taxes. So that's a part of what we will look at as to make sure that those measures that are put into place not only achieve their objective, but keep the city financially whole. And if not, then as we review these revenues and the finances, then we will point that out to the city in either our staff report for the 5-year plan or our revenue reports going forward.
Okay. And another question for you I wanted to ask is PICA's position on the progress of the city's making on establishing goals and performance measures that reflect the spending priorities? Is PICA satisfied with that?
Well, right now we are going through all the performance measures of the city, and as you know, we have criticized the city because they shift priorities from year to year. So it's hard to, on certain measures, they shift them or they delete them and add another one. So it's hard for anyone, especially PICA, to see, to give a report out to the citizens of how these measures are working. And so we've been going through every department and every performance measure, and we're actually almost at the completion of our data analysis, and we're ready to meet with the city to go over that with them, to show our concerns so that we can meet with them and make sure what we see is actually what we're seeing, and if there's any other measures or any other information that we're not seeing in that they could explain to us, and then we're going to go forward to the city and say, these are the measures that we think, we've discussed them with you, that going forward, that each department should be measuring their performance and their budget against these goals. So it is a concern of ours.
I hear you. And so if you're going to give the administration and my colleagues on council 3 recommendations from PICA that we should focus on during this financial situation we're in, what would those 3 suggestions be?
First of all, overtime. To get those, one concern of ours was that it's by the time we get these overtime reduction plans, we're halfway into the year. And then by the time you have those plans and you put them into start implementing them, you're into the latter part of the year. So it could delay the whole effect of reducing overtime for FY21. That would be one of them. And then there's certain departments that that I'll give you recreation, for instance. We were getting measures of how much acre of grass was cut. I would rather see how many kids are served by after-school programs at recreation centers. I think that says more to the community and what their needs are than acres of grass cut. So that's another one. But there's so many in the department, and that's what we want to sit with the city, because we might not understand something as we're looking at it, and they might come back and say, well, this is why we measure it. And then after that, we will come forward with our report of where we think measures should be for every department. And that report will be given to City Council as well as the citizens of Philadelphia.
Okay, thank you. Well, I want to thank the first panel, and thank you all for being here. And Harvey, I thank you for all your input and information, and thank PICA. And
You're welcome.
Marissa, thank you. And Marissa and Rob, thank you. And I guess we'd like to go to the second panel, and I'll ask Ms. Gerbach to call up the second panel.
Hi, our second panel is going to be Rob Dubow and Sarah DeWolf.
Okay, I'd like to. I guess we can get started, and I guess maybe Sarah, you want to get started, or Rob, you want to start?
I'll start real briefly to give an overview, and I'm not going to reread my testimony, which introduced all of it. I'm just going to quickly go through what we're going to do, which is update you since the last time we were here. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've allocated our $276 million in coronavirus relief funds money. And then Sarah's going to, since we've been here a while already, quickly walk you through the presentation. So well over half of our funding is going to public health and public safety. That includes payroll costs, other expenses. And after that, the next two biggest areas are small business assistance and housing support. Between those two, with the changes we agreed to make today, we're looking at close to $80 million in funding in just those two areas. Most of everything else is relatively small, but with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Sarah so she can update you with what's happened since the last time we were here.
Thanks, Rob. Good afternoon, Councilmember Dom and members of the committee, and thank you for the opportunity to provide you with an update on the city's financial recovery efforts in response to COVID-19. In September, as Rob mentioned, we gave Council a briefing that provided an overview of the work that's underway, the impact that COVID-19 has had in Philadelphia, some of the challenges that we faced, our strategy for deploying recovery funding, and how the city's focus on equity has influenced the city's response. My presentation today will focus on updates since that briefing in September, with a focus on the information highlighted in our first public quarterly recovery report, which was published in early November. So first, I'm going to give an overview of the recovery grants secured by the city and by other organizations within Philadelphia. Then I'll describe some of the recent challenges that we're facing and how those challenges are impacting our recovery work. Next, I'll provide an overview of how the city is spending its recovery funds, focusing primarily on the most flexible funding that we've received to date, which is the Coronavirus Relief Fund, and which Rob just alluded to. And then finally, I'll highlight some recent commitments that we've made to support relief efforts with our recovery funds and close with what's on the horizon for the Recovery Office. So this slide provides an overview of the recovery grants secured by the City of Philadelphia. As of early November, the city had received $616 million in grants to support the response to and recovery from COVID-19. As you can see on the pie chart, the largest funding source that the city has received is the Coronavirus Relief Fund allocation from U.S. Treasury. This funding was authorized through the CARES Act and went to states and counties with populations greater than 500,000. The city received $276.4 million from the Coronavirus Relief Fund, or CRF. The second largest category of funding that the city has received is the FAA airport grants, also authorized by the CARES Act. These funds total $121 million and can be used to support continuing operations and replacement of lost revenue due to COVID-19. The third largest category of funding comes from CDC grants, and that totals $102.3 million. And in addition to the categories already mentioned, the city's also received $37.6 million in community development block grants, $35.3 million in emergency solutions grants, $9.3 million from the Commonwealth, which includes additional funding for homeless services, food programs, and election assistance, and $29.5 million in other funding categories, including health and human services preparedness and response grants, election support, a supplemental COVID-19 FEMA assistance to firefighters grant, additional HRSA funding, and housing opportunities for persons with AIDS or HOPWA. Let me just go back one. One other note I wanted to make on this slide is that almost all of these grants come with fairly strict requirements governing how the funding can be used. Our quarterly recovery report includes a section at the end that lays out all of the requirements for these grants in detail, along with the timeframes within which the grants must be used. In addition to being our largest funding source, the Coronavirus Relief Fund is also our most flexible funding source, but it also has restrictions. It must be used on necessary costs related to the pandemic that were previously unbudgeted and incurred between March 1st and December 30th. So this slide shows a broader picture of the $3.5 billion in recovery funding that has come to the city of Philadelphia as a whole and how that funding can be used. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but as you can see, the majority of the funding the city and other Philadelphia organizations has received is for medical and public health related work associated with the pandemic. And transportation funding represents the next biggest category. One other note I'll make on this slide is that the disaster recovery funding shown here as 0% is shown that way because the city is eligible to receive funding from FEMA public assistance for costs incurred as a result of emergency protective measures implemented in response to COVID-19. But that grant is administered on a reimbursement basis and it's uncapped. So how much we draw down will depend on what we can justify and what we can get reimbursed through FEMA. And then this last slide just shows that same $3.5 billion that's coming to the city as a whole, broken down by recipient organization. And here you'll also see Philadelphia hospitals and healthcare providers are the largest recipients of recovery funding, followed by the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, the City of Philadelphia, and the school district. And other recipient organizations shown here include things like educational institutions of higher ed, the Philadelphia Housing Authority, the Delaware River Port Authority, and early learning center providers. So I just want to give a brief overview of some of our more recent challenges that we're encountering. And as the city plans for use of its recovery funding, one of the biggest challenges that we're encountering is the resurgence of the virus over the last several months. As of November 30th, Philadelphia has tragically experienced 67,283 confirmed cases and 1,976 deaths resulting from COVID-19. As a result of this resurgence, as Rob mentioned earlier, the city is experiencing increased costs associated with its response to the pandemic, and the need for economic and housing relief has also increased with the implementation of necessary public health measures to control spread of the virus. While the city's $276.4 million of CRF funding has enabled the city to cover many of its response costs and to administer relief programs, the funding can only be used to cover costs through December 30th, 2020. This means that the city is facing new unbudgeted expenses for the second half of fiscal year 2021 that include costs for PPE, vaccine storage and distribution, isolation, quarantine, and prevention spaces, targeted cleaning of city facilities, access centers, and more. While the city's costs are increasing, additional relief does not seem likely in the near term. In November, the administration and city council advocated for the state to distribute a portion of its remaining $1.3 billion of CRF funding to Philadelphia, using population as the basis for distributing those funds. However, in late November, the state legislature reached agreement on legislation to use this funding to balance the state budget. In addition, efforts to date to reach consensus regarding a federal relief package have been unsuccessful. We're continuing to lobby for additional federal relief in the form of revenue replacement and flexible funding that extends beyond December 30th. But so far, Congress has failed to coalesce around another relief package for state, local, and tribal governments. So on this slide, I'll give you a short overview of how we're spending recovery funding with the focus on our most flexible funding source, the CRF. So as Rob mentioned, the city's fully allocated the $276.4 million received through the CARES Act and is on pace to incur these funds by the December 30th deadline. The largest category of expense is payroll costs for public health and safety employees, substantially dedicated to the public health response. Since March, many of the city's public health and safety staff have been fully dedicated to the city's response, conducting disease surveillance, distributing meals, providing treatment and testing, operating the city's emergency operations center, transporting the sick, and limiting the spread of COVID-19 within congregate settings. In addition to these costs, the city has and is incurring sizable expenses associated with public health and medical costs. These costs include expenses to purchase and distribute PPE to city workers, hospitals and first responders, costs to clean and modify city facilities to allow continuity of operations while limiting the spread of the virus, expanded morgue capacity, public health awareness campaigns, and more. The third largest category of expense for CRF is costs to enable economic relief for small businesses, nonprofits, and renters. With recognition of the sizable need for economic relief, the city has allocated over a quarter of its CRF funding to implementing relief programs where possible, pairing its CRF funding with funding from other sources, such as funding from the state and philanthropic dollars, to maximize the benefits for Philadelphia businesses and renters. This slide shows how the city's CRF funds have been allocated in greater detail. Other costs not previously mentioned include funding for hotspots to enable distance learning and address the digital divide, costs associated with the city's recovery office and disaster relief consultant, who is helping the city maximize its federal funding while minimizing audit risks, and costs of providing telework capabilities for public employees so that city operations may continue during the pandemic. Interest costs associated with the city's short-term borrowing, or TRAN, are also eligible for reimbursement through CRF. And this slide provides more detail on how CDBG and ESG supplemental funding is being deployed. The majority of CDBG funds are being deployed to help renters who have been economically impacted by COVID-19 and to provide other forms of housing support. Much of the city's ESG funding is going to support the city's shelter system and to provide rapid rehousing for those who need it. So in this next quick update on programmatic activity, but I'm just going to focus on new funding allocations not covered in the presentation we gave in September. So in November, the city announced that it was committing an additional $20 million of CRF funding to support a third phase of rental assistance for Philadelphians. Recipients will include eligible applicants who applied to phase 2 of our rental assistance program, but who did not have responsive landlords. Assistance of up to $1,500 a month will be provided for up to 6 months and will serve approximately 4,800 households. This additional funding for rental assistance follows the commitment of $10 million of CDBG COVID funds to provide a first round of rental assistance, as well as the commitment of $9.44 million of CRF funds to supplement the state-run program administered by PHFA by increasing the maximum amount of monthly assistance available from the $750 allowed by PHFA's program to $1,500, and by providing funding for administration of the program. With the city and state's contribution, over $6 million will have been invested to assist Philadelphians who have been economically impacted by COVID-19 and are unable to pay their rent through these 3 phases. Also in November, the city announced that it was committing an additional $10 million of CRF funding through the Commonwealth's COVID-19 relief Pennsylvania statewide small business assistance program. This new funding will be used to provide grants for some of the Philadelphia-based applicants who remained unfunded after the second round of grants announced by the Commonwealth. This $10 million is in addition to the $20 million that was committed to the Commonwealth's business relief program in September, which will also Philadelphia businesses who were unfunded after the second round of grants from the program. This funding, $30 million in total, including the commitment the city made in September, is expected to provide relief to an additional 1,500 businesses in the city. When combined with these other contributions to small business and nonprofit assistance, the city will have contributed $39.4 million of local funding for business relief associated with the pandemic. This funding, when combined with the $64.5 million that's been made available from other funding sources, including the Commonwealth and philanthropy, will total more than $100 million in support to Philadelphia's small businesses and nonprofits, and is on top of direct federal aid relief programs such as the Paycheck Protection Program.
Questions for you, and then I know Councilmember Green has a question too. Basically, we're not going to be in any position of returning any of these monies. We're going to make sure that we spend all the monies that we're given so that there'll be no return back to the federal government. So I want to confirm that.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And then on your November 5th report, it said that the city of Philadelphia had received, I think it was about $616 million in COVID-related grants.
Yes.
And local institutions, I think, received about an additional $2.9 billion in recovery grants. So the total was $3.5 billion coming into Philadelphia. I know the city's 616, I guess, represented about 18% of that total. So I know we put $1 billion of appropriation authority into the grants revenue fund to allow us to distribute the grants to departments. Your report does a very good job in laying out, what the recovery dollars have been spent on, but I wasn't as clear on how these recovery dollars fit in with our budget process. So my first question is about the city's portion of the recovery funding. Where in the budget has that $616 million gone, and where did it get spent from? And are these funds passing into the grants revenue fund and being spent by departments from there? And then the question is multiple questions here. If so, how much of that $1 billion in appropriating authority remains available at this point? And are the funds, like some of the housing dollars, being added as supplements to existing funding streams? And I guess the question is, how can we get a look at the quarterly reports and see where that $616 million is?
So I think the answer is complicated. There are some grants where we spend out of the general fund and seek reimbursement. There are other grants that do get booked into the grants revenue fund and we spend against those grants directly. I think probably what would be best is if we give you a kind of a written answer to that lays out this in more detail, just because I do think it's a complicated answer to your question.
That's totally fine. Here's my next question. How much of our fiscal 20 overtime was reimbursed by CARES money, and how much of fiscal year 21 so far was reimbursed? And can you give us kind of a breakdown of how much overtime is covered by different recovery-related reimbursements?
Yeah, Councilman Gilmore Richardson asked us for that detail, and we said we'd get back to you with that and lay that all out. So that'll be another thing we'll follow up with.
Okay. I think Councilmember Green had a question. I'll go to Councilmember Green, and I can always come back. Councilmember Green?
Yeah, thank you, Rob and Sarah. I just wanted to follow up on some information you provided. Some of the information that you provided, as well as information you provided via email that came out of our Finance Committee hearing on Monday. So my understanding of the CRF or the coronavirus relief funds, the city has received $276 million of that. Of that 276, about 38 million was allocated for small business relief.
Actually, Sarah, can you go to page? I think it's page 12 in your version.
Yeah, and of that 38 million, well, I know the numbers. Of the 38 million, about 30 million was direct assistance, some to the augment the state program, and then others with that first round of economic stimulus dollars, which was that phase one. The question I have is that, considering that all CRF and actually all CARES dollars, from my understanding, have to be spent by December 30th of this year, have those dollars been allocated and are out the door? And how are we monitoring how those dollars being spent? And I guess my question is, from a regulatory perspective, oversight, when the federal government is saying spent, does that mean that we have allocated or dispersed those dollars to those various entities and that's considered being spent? Or those entities actually have used those dollars in some type of reporting back to the city, which then will have to be reported back to the federal government?
Yeah, so I'll answer that question in two parts. So the first, I think, was your question about this latest $30 million, and is that getting out the door quickly? Because obviously it's December 2nd and all funds have to be incurred by December 30th. So the answer to that is yes. We received an invoice from the CDFI network. They should receive the funds this week. And we're in very close communication with them about making sure that we can move quickly to disperse these funds. I think one of the advantages of the program design is that we already have an applicant pool. So even though they haven't been able to necessarily move on pushing the money out, they're sitting on that applicant pool and can kind of begin the process of reviewing who might actually receive those dollars. To answer your question about whether the dollars must be spent by December 30th, the answer is a little bit complicated, but in this particular context of relief programs, there is a little bit of flexibility. What's most important is that any relief that we provide to small businesses is for costs incurred through December 30th, but we have a small window of about 90 days that we could continue to administer those relief payments. The challenge is that we can't incur any administrative costs after December 30th. So we want to try to get that money out the door as quickly as possible because it's kind of the most efficient way for us to use those funds. And obviously the need is urgent. But if we, for whatever reason, ran into any sort of obstacle, we couldn't get all of the money out the door by December 30th for this particular small business assistance phase 2 program, we could continue to administer some of those relief programs in the new year, or some of those relief payments in the new year.
Okay, so my understanding is that we couldn't incur administrative expenses to get the dollars out after January, well,
after December 30th.
After December 30th. Why the 30th, not 31st? That's very odd, but
we don't know.
Someone forgot the days a bunch.
Somebody made a typo.
Yeah, so after December 30th. So we can, the reason I asked the question is it seems from my observation and also from, and we've had some calls with people at NLC and others, that they use kind of the CDBG kind of rubric on a lot of these dollars. And I know from Community Development Block Grant dollars, people allocate and reallocate dollars all the time. And I wanted to make sure, I was curious in reference to, if you designate who the dollars are going to go to, is that considered being spent by that time? If for whatever reason, the entity, and this happens with CDBG dollars all the time, we're contemplating year, I think 46, that they allocate these dollars either in our program statement or our comp plan that gets approved by HUD by the new fiscal year at the federal level. By October 1, but then sometimes those entities, for whatever reason, couldn't use those dollars, and those dollars get reallocated. So that's why I was curious when I kept hearing about this December 30th date. Does that actually mean that, similar to at the state level with DCED, those dollars actually have to be spent, and then there's a reporting back from the city or the entity that received the dollars, how they spent those dollars, back to the state, or we just allocated those dollars to the entity. We intended them to use it because they said they were going to, but for whatever reason, they weren't able to use it because things changed, maybe, and the business unfortunately went out of business before they could receive the dollars and actually use the dollars, and then we still could use those dollars. So what I'm hearing is that we still can get the dollars out the door for another 90 days. We just can't charge any admin expenses for use of those dollars. And so if that's the case, we would just, I guess, incur them through our traditional expenditures of general fund dollars, or could we use CDBG dollars as we normally would for some of these programs because I know CDBG also has restrictions on how dollars can be used, even though we're spending CARES dollars after December 30th.
Yeah, I mean, I would defer to planning and development on the details of the CDBG administration. I will say we can effectively reallocate or kind of use up like the CRF dollars after December 30th, again, for costs that we've already incurred or for costs that small businesses have already incurred. So, you know, one of the things that we're thinking about and that we're doing with our consultants is really reviewing the documentation behind each of the costs that we're planning to charge to CRF, and making sure that we effectively load up that $276.4 million with the most kind of secure, audit-worthy expenses possible. So we do have some flexibility there. Treasury has made it a little bit more difficult for us in that they do require very detailed quarterly reporting, and it gets complicated if we try to start de-obligating and re-obligating funds. So I think our strategy is to try to avoid that as much as possible, but to know that it does provide us a little bit of flexibility if we were to have underspend in a particular budgeted area and we kind of get those actuals after December 30th, we could then, you know, take those funds and apply them elsewhere.
There's one more follow-up question about that. Considering that we can expend, for example, CRF dollars after December 30th, and if we are using CDBG, for example, funded employees to do that, has there been any review on whether we're using, and this I guess would be going prospective, using CDBG funded staff to do activities that are not CDBG eligible activities using the CRF funds? The reason I'm asking that question is that, you know, the Code of Federal Regulation, the reference CDBG, they take a very detailed perspective. In a sense, they almost use kind of the one drop rule. So if one drop of CDBG dollars are being spent, then anything that's connected to that expenditure, even if it's just merely a CDBG funded employee administering dollars that are, say, CRF dollars, but if those CRF dollars are not being used on a CDBG eligible activity, then there could be some challenges from HUD on the allocation or the use of CDBG funds to pay for that staff person's salary or the administrative costs to that during that administration. So I wasn't sure if there's been any changes in that regard, because we want to continue to get those dollars out for, you know, using CRF funds. But the question is whether those expenditures would be considered CDBG eligible if we are using city employees whose salaries are funded by community development block grant dollars.
Yeah, to be completely honest, I don't know the answer to that question outright. I mean, I think that's something we'd have to look into. I do know generally that, you know, CRF is kind of an unusual funding source and that it can sort of be the last dollar in a lot of different ways. And there are often more tighter constraints around other funding sources and preferences about when and where they can be applied and how they can be mixed with other funding. So it's definitely something we want to look into and get back to you on.
And finally, the consultant you're working with, will you still be working with them beyond December 30th, going into the new calendar year? Or
I think the answer is yes, but in a more limited capacity. Okay. And we intend to kind of phase out our work with them.
Okay. But issues like this that if they happen to come up could be, you could use them to kind of find out some of these details. So you want to have those issues. Okay. Yep. All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Green. Great questions. I have two more quick questions for you, Sarah, before we're complete. I don't think we have any other questions from my colleagues yet. But, you know, the background that we've learned is that usually there's a lot of strict restrictions on how funding from other governments can be spent. And I recently heard that COVID assistance dollars cannot be used to assist with utility payments if the utility is municipally owned, like
Yeah.
even has separate governance, like like our water department and PGW, is that true?
I think there's nuance to it. I'm familiar with what you're referring to, and I think the concern there is that the CARES Act was very clear that coronavirus relief fund money cannot be used for revenue reimbursement. And so some people view assistance to provide utility payments as effectively a government paying itself back. I do think there's some nuance in some of the more recent guidance that's been issued. I don't have it, at hand, but I can certainly follow up with you and kind of give you that clarification. I think some of it may be allowable, but not like back pay. There's some nuance to it.
Okay, I just want to make sure we can help those who need that help and not have a barrier. Are there any other barriers, by the way, that we're dealing with to get these relief dollars out the door?
I think the short answer is no. We have plenty of need, and it's really just making sure that we do our due diligence on reviewing documentation. I guess that one of the challenges with CRF has been just the constantly changing guidance. So they've updated their guidance last week. Again, I think this was update number 14 or 15. So they've done it, a couple times a month since they sent us the money. And the guidance has evolved over time. In some ways, that makes sense. In other places where, it's been a kind of clear change in direction. I think we're fortunate that we have been somewhat slow and deliberate to allocate our dollars because we have benefited from waiting. But, other cities and counties who moved quickly to allocate their dollars are now dealing with some challenges where, the guidance now looks different than it did, in April or in May.
Okay. I do have another comment or question really is that, and I want to piggyback on Councilmember Green's questions on the small business funding. When you look at the funding that we're doing for rental assistance, which is great, and for eviction prevention, which is great, it's all great. A lot of it's coming, not all, but a lot of it's coming because people have lost jobs and they don't have an income. And if we deal with the source of why they don't have an income, which is small businesses in many cases, and help those small businesses, we might be able to avoid a higher requirement in the rental assistance and other programs. So that's more the root of the cause, dealing with helping the businesses and keeping people employed versus having to just, add more money into that rental assistance program down the road. It's just something to keep in mind. Last question of today for you. Back in November, the state used, I think, $1.3 billion in CARES dollars to fill holes in the state budget. What's the difference in the CARES regulations that allowed the state to supplement their budget with relief dollars while limiting municipal CARES spending to unanticipated costs? And what did we lose out in terms of potential relief funding when the state Republicans, I guess, partnered with the governor and chose to keep $1.3 billion for itself instead of making tough decisions and providing relief to impacted businesses, organizations, and individuals?
So to be clear, the same rules apply to the state as the city of Philadelphia around use of these funds. What the state took advantage of is actually part of what has been the evolving guidance around the definition of substantially dedicated employees who are substantially dedicated to the pandemic response. So early on, when the CRF was issued, it was very clear that we couldn't use it for budgeted expenses. The guidance has evolved to say that we can presume that certain classes of employees, such as EMS workers or people who work in our health centers, may be presumed to be substantially dedicated to the pandemic response and therefore performing a substantially different job than what was budgeted for, and therefore not a budgeted expense. And that we could then charge their entire payroll costs, including benefits, to CRF. So I think this is just kind of a difference in philosophy. We are planning to charge some of our personnel costs to our CRF. And as Rob mentioned, being able to do that does allow us to free up some general fund dollars for the second half of the year to help with our pandemic response. But we've also, put money towards relief programs, and also used, quite frankly, a large portion of our CRF just to fund core costs related to our public health response, things like public health and medical costs. So I think it's just sort of, each entity has taken a different approach to how they distribute those funds.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. And listen, we appreciate your testimony today and answering all of our questions. And you're doing a great job. Keep up the good work.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I have one follow-up question.
Oh, sure, Councilman Green.
You give me the thumbs up in my inbox. Yeah, I just want to follow up on the question that Councilmember Dom raised. And correct, I may be incorrect, but that use of CARES dollars for that budget shortfall, and I think you did state that they are under the same regulatory restrictions that we are. Is there some concerns there may be some repercussions for using those dollars that way?
I mean, I think this is also just, it comes down to how everybody's interpreting the guidance. Yeah. And since it's a new funding source, there's no way to know what, Treasury OIG will ultimately decide.
And they might be using it for public safety related personnel costs.
Right.
I think it was prisons is where they allocated
right.
it.
Their Department of Corrections. Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, the guidance, I think it's our opinion that the guidance is fairly clear that this is a legitimate path for a certain, certain types of employees, and the guidance specifically lists out examples. I don't know the specifics of what the state is doing. Like, I don't know exactly which positions they're reimbursing, and if there is, anything that's outside of that description. But, I think if you kind of stick to those very, very specific examples, it's in my opinion that it's fairly safe. But again, I think everybody has a different perspective on this, given that it's such a new funding source.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Green. And again, Sarah, I just wanted to thank you for your testimony today. Look forward to working with you. Keep up the great work. And we'll hopefully see you again here soon with more good news, hopefully. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Modesto, is there do we have a witness today from the public?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we do. We tried to contact the witness, but unfortunately, no answer.
Okay. All right, so I guess if there's no additional comments from my colleagues or witnesses, I just want to thank everyone again today for their ongoing analysis of our city's finances. Rob, Marissa, Harvey, and Sarah, thank you so much for everything. And I also appreciate all my colleagues who are here today and the massive amount of engagement and activity everyone's doing to try to help Philadelphia, which is pretty amazing. And this pandemic clearly has taken a toll on all of us, but we'll get to the other side. I'm very positive because I see light at the end of the tunnel here with the vaccines, and I think that's great. So we just need to stay focused on what matters most to our people and our businesses in the near term and in the future, so we can come back stronger than we were before. And if anyone else has anything else? Yes. Mr.
Chair, I have a point of information. I understand this hearing will be recessed to the call of the chair, but do you anticipate scheduling additional hearings in 2021?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this concludes the hearing on Resolution 200406, and the hearing is adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you very much.
Take care.